Greetings and welcome to this segment on mental health well-being with Dr. Charmain Jackman. The My Members Wellness ERG group appreciates your commitment in being part of this conversation by listening to the podcast as well as engaging in the Feeling Bot application. Dr. Jackman is a Harvard-trained licensed psychologist with over 23 years in the mental health field. She currently serves as the Dean of Health and Wellness at Boston Arts Academy, the only Boston public school for visual and performing artists. Dr. Jackman is the founder and CEO of InnoPsych Incorporated, an organization on a mission to change the face of therapy and to promote wellness and healing for people of color. InnoPsych Inc. was awarded the 2019 Citizens Bank Small Business Community Champion Award for increasing access to therapy through its online therapist of color directory. As a change maker, Dr. Jackman is passionate about the intersection of psychology, mental health, and DE&I, and has created social impact initiatives that support community members and mental health professionals. Hello, my name is Minnie, and I'm a project manager at Heritage Tufts Health Plan in the Government Affairs Department, and I'm lucky to be hosting this conversation with Dr. Jackman. Thank you for your time, Dr. Jackman. It's a pleasure to meet you virtually.
Thank you, Minnie. Thanks for being here, and it's great to be back for this series.
Thank you. Sonia Renee Taylor, in her book, The Body is Not an Apology, notes that depression, bipolar disorder, and other examples of neurodivergence are stigmatized because we're unwilling to extend the same care and treatment to our brains that we afford to our bodies. Can you explain why this happens?
Sure. And I want to just name, I think we know so much about the brain, and yet there's so much we still don't know. And I think one of the things about the brain is that when we particularly compare it to other physical problems, say, for example, a broken leg or a broken arm, that you can often see those injuries, right? And people know how to care for those. I think those hidden injuries or hidden illnesses that are more mysterious, our culture does not have a history of really understanding how they present. There are ways in which people present it from a cultural background, and those have been stigmatized with traditional therapy. So there are a number of reasons why that happens. But again, I think as we think about from the perspective of the mental health conditions you mentioned, like depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, there's a lot of stigma around those because, again, there are these mysteries about how they happen, why they happen, how to often treat them within a cultural context. And so without having a lot of narratives that come from within the culture around those, again, I think traditional, historical, and within the mental health field have really done a lot to pathologize ways that people presented. So there's a lot of stigma and misunderstanding about that. And I think those are parts of the reasons why there's so much stigma around these mental health conditions.
Right, and that really hits upon my question for you today because I've heard a lot of family and friends, and especially like in the South Asian community, that are, I guess the word is turned off by the concept of going to therapy or talking about your feelings. And so how, with that audience in mind, would you suggest sort of explaining or sharing your own experience of, hey, this is how therapy worked out for me, or taking care of your mental health? Can you explain that benefit to that audience?
Yeah, and again, I think I go back to, I'm a psychologist, and I have had to relearn how I was trained to be a psychologist, particularly because the people that I work with, the communities that I work with are communities of color that have historically been left out of research, that have been left out of the theoretical models around therapy. When we think about therapy, we think about talk therapy, right? You have to come in, talk to a complete stranger about your concerns, and then they're going to kind of magically give you the answer, right? That's kind of the schema that we have about therapy. In many cultures, in my culture, you don't tell people who are not in the family your business, right? So there's that, that you have to start there. So again, like this whole idea of therapy was not centered in the experiences of communities of color. And so we have that problem that we as therapists and mental health professionals have to really address. So again, as I said, I had to unlearn the way that I was taught how to practice therapy if I was going to be successful in my own working with the communities that I really wanted to work with. So I think there's a need for therapists and people in the mental field to understand that we have to recognize that some of the ways in which we were taught don't match up with how people experience difficulties or challenges in their lives. There's often this quick to label that, right? So, and we often, because therapy is based on an individualistic framework, it kind of leaves family members out of that process, right? It excludes family members from being part of that process. Again, it's not the way that communities operate. And so there lends to that stigma or that distrust about therapies. Like, so I can be included in part of in this framework. So there are those pieces. And I think, really in what I have found helpful when I'm working with communities of color is really not coming from a place as I'm the expert, right? And that I know it all, but recognizing that there are already resources and strengths within the individual or the family that I'm working with. I tap into those first, right? How have you dealt with this? What has worked so far? Rather than coming from that negative perspective as there's a problem and I am the only one who has the answer. So there's a way that you're building trust and building community with those individuals. And you're figuratively speaking the language of the community, right? So I'm not coming in with my own framework and my own language, but I'm collaborating, I'm coming in and I'm helping the family and the community tap into resources that they already have.
Okay, that's extremely helpful, because I think the idea that someone's an expert and telling another person how to live their lives is, obviously you're going to be defensive or not responsive to that. So I think that's important.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the other thing that I find tough is when I was exploring family therapy, there's not a lot of Indian therapists. And so I think, are there, not that that's critical, but I thought that would be helpful, because I felt like my family members would respond to someone that looked like them or talked like them.
Right.
But if that's not really an option, do you have any other sort of recommendations?
Yeah. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, right? Because it's about really giving people choice. And so for some people, they don't want someone from their culture because they worry like they're going to talk my business, or they're going to know, particularly if you're live in a community where there are not a lot of people from your cultural background. There's all of that concern. But you also don't want to have to go to therapy and have to explain every aspect of how your culture or your family functions. Well, I would say your culture functions, right? There are things there, when I work with Caribbean families, there are things that they can say and I immediately get it. They don't have to explain like why this happens or what are the implications of that particular thing. I just know because I come from that culture. And for my clients, they're like, I'm so glad I don't have to explain this, right? That you just know. And you don't judge my family or the way that we do things because you understand it within a cultural context. So I think it's really about people having access to choice. And that's why part of, the organization that I started was really about making sure that people have access and you can choose, right? If you're a family who wants someone from their cultural background, you should be able to find that easily. But if you want someone else, like you should have that choice too. So I think it's really about giving families choice. And when we see, when families or people from different cultural backgrounds don't see therapists or mental professionals reflected, again, it kind of leads back to that distrust. Why not, right? This is either it's not a viable field or there are ways that they have been excluded from that process as well. So I think it really lends people to be able to develop more trust when they have a choice and where they can choose, where there's a variety that they can choose from. So I think that's been the most helpful. And that's what I hear a lot from people who are seeking therapy services is they want to be able to choose and have people to choose from and not just have one person. Because the reality is that even if you have someone who's from a similar cultural background, there may be other values that are not the same, right?
Yeah.
So there's so much nuance in that relationship, and building and finding someone who's actually going to get you and not judge you, and feel supported by that person or that clinician.
Yeah, and I agree with that, because I think even though my family probably would have preferred someone with more knowledge of their background, I've always felt like I'm in a little bit of a hybrid situation, because I was born and raised here, and I'm also married to someone who's not Indian. And so just even that in itself is challenging. It's hard to put myself in a bucket of where I belong.
Yeah.
And so you're right, it is really nuanced. And then my other sort of thing is if you feel like someone is just totally resistant, not open to doing maybe one-on-one therapy, are there other sort of settings or things you could have them read or be exposed to that would kind of maybe help?
Yeah, so I in one of the prior episodes, I really talked about really kind of understanding the level of severity of your problem. Again, I would say also, like, I'm a therapist, so I often recommend therapy. But I know that therapy is not the only solution. And by far, I really encourage people to tap into other aspects. One of the things we talked about in one of the prior sessions was this wheel of wellness, and how there are these 7 components, right, that include our physical health, our social health, our emotional health, our spiritual health, financial, like all of these aspects really tap into and connect to how we feel as a whole person, right? They're so important to our holistic sense of self. And so for some people, something more physical might be more important. Something like connecting back to the book you mentioned, right? Using more body-based work. So talk therapy works for people who love to talk and can engage with that process. But there may be people who've experienced some trauma, and that trauma is living in their body, and they really need to use some body work. So there are other processes like EMDR, brain spotting, somatic experiencing that actually tap into more the trauma that lives in the body or inhibits the body, and allowing and giving space to release those. For some people with milder symptoms, tapping into yoga, really engaging in the environment, right? Whether it's, walks in nature or thinking about your physical or your living space could be helpful. For some people, it's journaling, doing some reflections in those ways are really helpful. But if you have someone who's experienced really severe mental health concerns, then there may need to be more invasive or intensive services. So therapy definitely might be helpful. Maybe a medication evaluation to see what if there are any medications that might be helpful for that person. Sometimes they may need other levels of care, like an outpatient therapy or an inpatient therapy support. Those are typically for people who may be experiencing suicidal ideation, or experiencing or displaying self-harm or self-injury. So they may need a higher level of care to really address their concerns. And so it's really not a one size fit all. And I could never say, well, this thing is going to work for you, right? From my experience, I always am tapping into, tell me about the things that you like to do. What are the things that bring you joy? What are the things that you already do that work for you? Let's tap into those and do those more, right? Let's make sure we have a daily practice, a daily routine of using those skills. And that might help. But you might use this and you're like, no, I'm still really struggling. So let's go up to the next level of care or next level of supports that can help you through this challenging time. But it requires people to be open and being willing to explore what's going on for them, to have that insight. I think one of the questions similar to your question earlier is like, how do I get my family member, how do I get my friend to want to, tap into therapy as a resource? I tell people it's really about sharing your own experiences, not telling or dictating to people what's going to be good for them, but noticing or sharing what you're concerned about with them, as a way to help them to maybe gain some of that insight about how their behaviors may be impacting their daily functioning.
Yeah, I think that's helpful, because personally, I think if people hear that I'm saying something's wrong with them, this kind of goes back to the stigma part too, where people are like, there's nothing wrong with me or my brain. So,
Right.
you know what I mean?
Right.
So I think that's important to consider, like how you talk about your experiences and that you're not, preaching.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. So
Right,
true.
right. And well, thank you so much. This has been so helpful for me. And I think just the fact that it's not a one size fits all solution is really helpful for me to hear. And that also that I can't really force people to do what they don't want to do. So it's more about
Mhm.
kind of educating and then leaving the option open to them. But I do really hope in our, small community that we can kind of talk about this stuff a little bit more freely. Because I think the stress of not being able to talk about it then
Mhm.
compounds whatever else you're already dealing with.
Right.
So,
Right. And you're so right, right? How do we start to create that language to normalize like talking about our emotional well-being, right? How do we make
mhm.
those conversations part of our dinner conversations are typical, like, how are you doing? Like, how are you really doing? How's your sleep? How's your
Mm,
mood? Right? Those are so important to really tap into. So I really appreciate you saying that.
mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'd love to leave with one coping strategy. I've kind of had this practice of ending with one coping strategy that I'd like to share. And this one is really connected to what we've been talking about it's about sharing your story. And
Mm,
there's a quote by Ivania Van Zant. I may not be pronouncing her name correctly, but she says, when you share your own story in an empowering way, your story heals you, but your story also heals others. And so it's really this important piece in when we're trying to connect with family members who we're worried about. One, it's more than one conversation, but how we share like things that we've struggled with and what we've done to overcome those things or work through those things is really important. Not starting
mm,
from a place of this is what you need to do, but here's a time where I struggled, and I worked through it, and I'd love to help you work through this thing that you're struggling with too. So I
mm.
think that sharing your story with others, people who've done therapy, the more that people can talk about, I've had a therapist, here's how it helped me, I think really starts to normalize that conversation about therapy and mental health.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for sharing that strategy. That's very helpful.
Great, thank you.